The sky over Pyongyang burned red, not from the sunset but from firebombs. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath the thunder of American planes. In the ruins, a quiet man stood unmoved, a former guerrilla turned supreme leader. His name was Kim Il-sung. But who was he, really? A patriot? A Soviet puppet? Or something else entirely? North Korea did not begin as a rogue state. It began as a dream, a promise of equality after decades of Japanese occupation, where schools trained children at gunpoint and resistance meant death. But that dream twisted. It hardened into steel and silence. From the smoldering legacy of imperialism to one of the most secretive regimes on Earth. This is not just the story of North Korea. It's a story of a nation split in half by strangers, ruled by myth and fueled by the ghosts of war. This is the entire history of North Korea, from colonial oppression and Cold War rivalry to dynastic worship and nuclear brinkmanship. And it all began with a line, drawn on a map by two American colonels who had never set foot on Korean soil. What if North Korea's story began not with the rise of a dynasty, but with the shattering of an ancient nation? What if the Hermit Kingdom's isolation wasn't simply a choice, but a desperate response to centuries of invasion, occupation, and abandonment? Picture a land once whole, 5,000 years of shared history, language, and tradition, suddenly cleaved in two by foreign powers who knew little of its people or their struggles. This is not merely the tale of an authoritarian regime's grip on power. It is the epic of a peninsula fractured, a civilization interrupted, and a people caught in the crossfire of ideologies that were never their own. Before the concrete barriers and propaganda broadcasts, before the nuclear ambitions and military parades, there existed a Korea unified under dynasties that had weathered centuries of storm and calm. A Korea that produced some of Asia's most magnificent art, literature, and philosophy, only to be swallowed by the imperial hunger of its neighbors. The Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945 didn't just exploit Korea's resources, it attempted to erase Korean identity itself. Language forbidden, culture suppressed, names changed. And when liberation finally arrived with Japan's defeat in World War II, it came with a terrible price: division along the 38th parallel, a hasty line drawn by American officials who never intended it to become a permanent border. What followed was catastrophe. The Korean War erupted in 1950, killing millions and devastating the peninsula. Cities were reduced to ash. Families were torn apart, some never to reunite. And when the guns fell silent in 1953, no peace treaty was signed. Only an armistice that left two Koreas staring at each other across a demilitarized zone, their shared history now diverging into radically different futures. In this vacuum of devastation, North Korea wasn't simply shaped by Kim Il-sung's vision. It emerged from the ruins of a proxy war, molded by Soviet influence and Chinese protection, driven by the trauma of aerial bombardment that leveled nearly every significant structure in its territory. The regime's paranoia wasn't born in a vacuum. It grew from the very real threat of invasion, from economic strangulation, from the knowledge that more powerful nations had already decided their fate once before. But what does this complex history reveal about North Korea today? How did a civilization with millennia of cultural achievement transform into the world's most secretive state? More importantly, how can we see beyond the caricatures to understand the 25 million people who call this land home, people with hopes, fears, and aspirations that exist independently of their government's actions? In this exploration, we'll venture beyond the headlines to uncover the hidden narratives of North Korea's past. We'll examine not just what happened, but why. We'll confront the brutal realities of repression and famine, but also acknowledge the society's remarkable resilience in the face of isolation and hardship. Join me as we untangle the threads of North Korea's complex history, one characterized by foreign intervention, ideological extremes, and a desperate search for security in an often hostile world. This story begins not with a single family's rise to power, but with the violent partition of an ancient nation and its ongoing struggle to define itself against overwhelming odds. This is the Peninsula Torn, the false hero, North Korea's deceptive origins. Imagine Korea, once a flourishing kingdom with cultural achievements rivaling China's ancient dynasties, stripped of its very soul, its language forbidden, its people subjugated under the merciless rule of Imperial Japan. But beneath the enforced silence and systematic humiliation, something was brewing. Not just resistance against foreign domination, but a complex web of ambition that would forever alter the course of a nation. And at its center stood a man whose true story has been buried beneath decades of carefully crafted mythology. What if I told you the most celebrated resistance hero in North Korean history was never the freedom fighter he claimed to be? What if the foundation of an entire nation was built upon a calculated deception that would chain millions to a destiny they never chose? When Japan annexed Korea in 1910, they didn't merely conquer territory. They launched a methodical campaign to eradicate Korean identity itself. The Korean language was banned from schools. Historical artifacts were plundered. Children were forced to adopt Japanese names. This wasn't just occupation, it was cultural genocide designed to transform Koreans into submissive imperial subjects, fueling Japan's expansionist war machine. From this cultural graveyard, resistance movements emerged like shadows in the darkness, fragmented, desperate, and increasingly radical. The Korean Independence Army formed in 1919, but it represented just one faction among many competing visions for Korea's future. And somewhere in this chaotic struggle, amid the snow-covered mountains of Manchuria, one name began to surface: Kim Il-sung. You've heard the official story: Kim Il-sung, the brilliant guerrilla commander who masterfully led the fight against Japanese oppression, beloved by his people for his courage and vision. But this narrative collapses under historical scrutiny. The truth? Kim was neither the origin nor the leader of Korea's resistance movement. He wasn't even considered significant by many of his contemporaries fighting for Korean independence. Kim's actual rise to prominence had little to do with battlefield heroism and everything to do with being in the right place at the right time when Japan's defeat in World War II created a power vacuum. By 1945, Kim commanded no significant forces and had no meaningful popular support. What he did have was something far more valuable in the emerging Cold War landscape: the attention of Soviet military intelligence. Why did Soviet authorities elevate this relatively minor figure over more established Korean resistance leaders? The answer reveals the cynical geopolitics of the era. Stalin's Soviet Union wasn't looking for Korean independence. They needed a reliable proxy who would advance their strategic interests in Northeast Asia. What they saw in Kim was a politically malleable figure who understood the language of communist ideology and demonstrated unwavering loyalty to Moscow. What Soviet authorities couldn't have anticipated was Kim's extraordinary talent for political survival. His ascent wasn't fueled by ideological conviction, but by a ruthless pragmatism that would later define his regime. As competing resistance factions vied for influence, Kim systematically eliminated rivals through denunciations, forced confessions, and strategic alliances. This wasn't just political maneuvering, it was betrayal on a national scale. While presenting himself as a champion of Korean sovereignty, Kim was actively colluding with foreign powers to secure his position, regardless of the consequences for the Korean people. The resistance fighters who had sacrificed everything alongside him were systematically sidelined or eliminated as Kim consolidated his power. But what specifically did Kim promise his Soviet patrons that made him their chosen instrument? How did this man, commanding no military forces and unknown to most Koreans, engineer his transformation into the absolute ruler of North Korea? The answer lies in a pact forged in the shadows. Kim offered the Soviets something no other Korean leader would: complete subordination of Korean national interests to Soviet strategic objectives. While publicly championing Korean independence, he privately assured Moscow that North Korea would serve as their loyal buffer state against American influence in Asia. As the artificial boundary along the 38th parallel hardened into one of history's most militarized borders, Kim meticulously constructed his personality cult, rewriting history to position himself as the embodiment of Korean resistance. The greatest deception wasn't just his falsified revolutionary credentials. It was the transformation of North Korea itself from a land fighting for independence into a personal fiefdom disguised as a people's republic. As this web of deception tightened around the North Korean people, a fateful question emerged. What devastating price would Korea pay for the division of its ancient land? The catastrophic consequences of decisions made in Moscow's corridors of power would soon engulf the peninsula in flames, but the match was struck far from Korean soil. Kim Il-sung's most powerful weapon was never military might. It was his ability to conceal ruthless personal ambition behind the veneer of patriotic sacrifice. And with this foundational lie, the Cold War would unfold not just between distant superpowers, but between brothers and sisters of a single Korean family, a division that continues to this day. The Sun Line, 38th parallel, 1945. What if the line that divided Korea wasn't drawn by the hands of history, but by the calculated whispers of men who never set foot in Korean soil? What if the 38th parallel, that scar across the Korean peninsula, was never about Korea at all, but about a global chess game where millions of Koreans were simply pawns? August 1945. Japan's surrender left a power vacuum in Korea, a nation that had spent 35 years under brutal colonial rule, its identity systematically erased, its people treated as subhuman laborers. Freedom was finally within reach. But here's what they never teach you in history class. Two American colonels tasked with finding a dividing line for occupation zones made their decision in 30 minutes. 30 minutes to split a 5,000-year-old civilization. They chose the 38th parallel not for any cultural or geographical significance to Korea, but because it conveniently placed the capital, Seoul, in the American zone. This wasn't liberation. This was theft. The theft of Korea's right to determine its own future. And the most horrifying part? It was meant to be temporary. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow and discover that an invisible wall has suddenly appeared through the middle of your country. Your sister lives on the other side now. Your parents too. You can't call them. You can't write to them. They might as well be dead. This actually happened. The division created an immediate humanitarian catastrophe that history books barely mention. Families who had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves separated by an arbitrary line, a line that became increasingly militarized with each passing day. Kim Sun-hee, a grandmother who fled south during the chaos, left behind her husband and two eldest children, thinking she would return within weeks. She never saw them again. Her remaining children grew up without a father. Her grandchildren grew up with phantom relatives they would never meet. And while families bled from the sudden severing, the architects of the division, Moscow and Washington, were focused on something else entirely, securing their spheres of influence in the emerging Cold War. Here's a shocking truth buried in declassified Soviet archives. Korea was never the endgame. The Soviet Union didn't merely accept the division of Korea. They engineered it as part of a larger strategy. Internal Soviet communications reveal that Stalin viewed Korea as an experimental laboratory for Soviet influence in Asia. The real target? Japan, China, the entire Pacific Rim. Korea was the testing ground for a new kind of warfare, not fought with bombs, but with ideologies that could capture nations without firing a single shot. And the Americans? They fell right into the trap, so desperate to contain communism that they overlooked the fact that they were participating in the destruction of a nation's soul. The 38th parallel wasn't just a border, it was the first battle line in a new kind of global conflict. In the midst of this geopolitical manipulation, emerged a figure whose very existence would come to define North Korea, Kim Il-sung. But here's the twist that will make you question everything you thought you knew. The man who became Kim Il-sung, the great leader of North Korea, wasn't even the real Kim Il-sung. The original Kim Il-sung was a legendary guerrilla fighter who died fighting the Japanese in the 1930s. The man who took his name, born Kim Song-ju, was a mid-level Soviet-trained operative who appropriated the dead hero's identity with Moscow's blessing. Even his Korean was rusty after years in Soviet Russia. When he was flown into Pyongyang in 1945, most Koreans had never heard of him. He was literally a Soviet creation, a carefully selected figurehead with no significant following among the Korean people. His first speech in Pyongyang had to be written by Soviet handlers. His security was provided by Soviet forces. His government was staffed by Soviet advisors. Yet this manufactured leader would go on to create the world's most isolated regime, a dictatorship so complete that it has survived for 3 generations, outlasting even the Soviet Empire that created it. The most devastating aspect of the 38th parallel wasn't the initial division. It was how quickly that temporary line hardened into something permanent and impenetrable. Within 5 years, that hastily drawn line would ignite a war that killed nearly 5 million people. Within 10 years, it would transform into the most heavily militarized border on Earth. Within a generation, it would create 2 societies so different they now struggle to even communicate in the same language. What started as marks on a map became concrete walls, landmines, guard towers, and automated machine guns. A temporary administrative boundary became a barrier between worlds, between families who share the same blood but can no longer share the same air. And beyond the physical barrier grew something even more impenetrable, 2 completely different versions of reality. In the North, time itself seemed to stop, a nation frozen in a perpetual 1950s aesthetic, worshiping leaders who promised protection from American imperialism. In the South, a technological powerhouse racing toward the future. The 38th parallel didn't just divide a country, it created parallel universes. When we look at North Korea today, its nuclear weapons, its human rights abuses, its dynastic leadership, we ask how such a regime could exist in the modern world. But we're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how North Korea became what it is. The question is, what would Korea have become if it had never been divided at all? Would a unified Korea have developed its own unique political system, neither communist nor capitalist? Would Korean culture have evolved differently without the trauma of war and division? Would the peninsula have become a bridge between East and West rather than a flashpoint? These questions haunt the Korean peninsula like ghosts, possibilities that were murdered in their infancy by the line that should never have been drawn. As we unravel this history, one truth becomes increasingly clear. North Korea, as we know it today, isn't the creation of the Kim dynasty. It isn't even the creation of communism. North Korea is the creation of division itself. Every aspect of its paranoid militaristic society traces back to that moment in 1945, when two American officers drew a line across a map and two empires decided to use that line to play out their global ambitions. The regime's propaganda, its cult of personality, its obsession with self-reliance, all of these are responses to the original wound of division. Even its nuclear weapons program is, at its core, a desperate attempt to ensure that Korea will never again be carved up by foreign powers. In the twisted logic of history, the division that was meant to be temporary became the very foundation of a regime that has outlasted the Cold War itself. And the most haunting question remains: what happens when a wound that has defined a nation for 80 years finally begins to heal? Two nations born in rage. The Korean War didn't begin with artillery fire in 1950. It began with the scratch of a pencil in 1945, when two foreign officers who couldn't locate Pyongyang on a map divided 5,000 years of history with a ruler and called it liberation. 1945, August 10th, 1945. A basement office in the Pentagon. The war against Japan is all but won, and two American colonels are handed a mission that will shatter millions of lives, divide Korea into occupation zones before sunrise. The catch? Neither man has ever studied Korea. Neither speaks the language. Neither has ever met a Korean. Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, men whose names most Koreans have never heard, made the most consequential decision in modern Korean history in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom. With nothing but a National Geographic magazine map and a looming midnight deadline, they chose the 38th parallel for one reason only. It kept Seoul in the American zone. Not a single Korean was consulted. Not one cultural boundary was considered. Not one family tie was respected. This wasn't just bad diplomacy, this was cartographic violence. When dawn broke across the peninsula, Koreans awoke to discover they now lived in different countries. A grandmother in Seoul could no longer visit her grandson in Pyongyang. A farmer suddenly needed papers to reach his own fields. A nation that had survived 3,000 years of Chinese dynasties and 35 years of Japanese brutality was dismembered in a single night by allies who promised freedom. That's how civilizations die. Not with bombs and bullets, but with bureaucracy. 1945 to 1947. The man who would become North Korea's eternal president was in 1945 a nobody, a Soviet fabrication. Soviet military archives, declassified only in 1992, reveal that Kim Il-sung's legendary guerrilla exploits were largely mythological. His actual unit was decimated by Japanese forces in 1940. For most of World War II, he commanded fewer than 100 men in a Soviet-controlled auxiliary unit that saw minimal combat. His most significant qualification? Absolute loyalty to Moscow. When Soviet officials introduced Kim to the North Korean people in October 1945, his Korean was so rusty that he stumbled through his speech. Many in the crowd had expected the real Kim Il-sung, a famous resistance leader who, unbeknownst to them, had died years earlier. Instead, they got a Soviet proxy whose birth name wasn't even Kim Il-sung. Moscow didn't just install a leader, they implanted a living propaganda poster. In the South, America needed their own strongman and found him 7,000 miles away in Washington, D.C. Internal State Department memos described Rhee as politically toxic. pathologically anti-communist and dangerously unstable. He had lived in American exile for nearly 40 years, longer than he had ever lived in Korea. His Korean was formal and antiquated. He had no popular support, but he had one invaluable trait. He would do whatever Washington wanted. Two men, two puppet governments, neither chosen by the Korean people, both installed by foreign powers playing a global game with local pawns. Their legitimacy wasn't derived from the will of the people, but from the barrel of foreign guns. 1947 to 1948. As the Cold War intensified, so did the brutality of both regimes. The promise of Korean independence had mutated into something monstrous. In the South, where America claimed to be building democracy, Rhee's police state arrested over 250 people daily for alleged communist sympathies. Torture became policy. Disappearances became normal. Villages suspected of leftist sympathies were systematically purged. On Jeju Island, now a tourist paradise with five-star resorts, South Korean forces slaughtered between 30,000 and 60,000 civilians, beginning in April 1948. 1 in 5 islanders died. American military advisors witnessed the atrocities, documented them in classified cables, and were ordered to remain silent. In the North, Kim's regime moved with Soviet-like efficiency to eliminate all opposition. Former independence fighters who questioned Soviet influence simply vanished. Christian churches that had survived Japanese persecution were shuttered overnight. Land reform, initially popular, became a tool to identify and eliminate class enemies. By 1948, what started as a temporary division had hardened into 2 police states, 2 dictatorships, 2 systems of terror, each claiming to be the legitimate voice of the Korean people, each planning to liberate the other half by force. The Korean people weren't divided by ideology. They were divided by geometry and then forced to die for lines they never drew. But there was a third Korea, one that history has nearly forgotten. A Korea that rejected both dictatorships. Between 1945 and 1950, the largest political force in Korea wasn't Kim's communists or Rhee's conservatives. It was the moderate nationalist coalition led by Kim Koo and Yoon Hyung. They proposed a unified neutral Korea that would be neither a Soviet satellite nor an American protectorate. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee had them assassinated. When Koreans rose up against foreign occupation, against the artificial division of their homeland, they were labeled insurgents and terrorists. Their villages were burned, their leaders executed, their existence erased from official histories. The greatest victims of the Cold War weren't soldiers. They were civilians caught between ideologies they never chose. By January 1950, the 38th parallel had become the most militarized border on Earth. Over 250 border clashes had already occurred, most never reported in Western media. Both Kim and Rhee were begging their superiors for permission to invade the other side. Both were convinced they would be welcomed as liberators. What history records as the start of the Korean War, the North's invasion on June 25, 1950, was merely the spark that ignited a powder keg 5 years in the making. A war that had already begun in the hearts and minds of a people whose fate had been decided in 30 minutes by strangers with a map. And when that war finally exploded into open combat, it wouldn't be fought for Korean freedom. It would be fought for the right to determine who would control Korea's prison. The question history forgets to ask: what would Korea have become if left to Koreans? They didn't call it a war. They called it a police action, a bureaucratic euphemism for what would become the most concentrated slaughter of the 20th century. Within 6 weeks, over 300,000 people were dead, most of them civilians who never understood what ideology they were dying for. June 23rd to 25th, 1950. At 4 a.m. on June 25th, 1950, North Korean tanks thundered across the 38th parallel. In Washington, President Truman called it an unprovoked surprise attack. In history books, it's presented as a bolt from the blue. Both claims are deliberate deceptions. 48 hours before North Korean forces moved south, U.S. signals intelligence intercepted explicit communications about the impending invasion. These warnings reached the Pentagon, but were systematically downgraded and buried. Why ignore an impending war? Because acknowledging it meant admitting America's Korean strategy had catastrophically failed. Behind North Korea's offensive stood Soviet Colonel Nikolai Vasilyev, the actual architect of the invasion plan. For months, Soviet advisors had positioned artillery, trained tank crews, and calculated ammunition requirements. Kim Il-sung wasn't acting alone. He was executing a meticulously engineered Soviet strategy. American intelligence agencies knew North Korea was amassing forces at the border. They tracked Soviet weapons shipments. They documented troop movements. But the Truman administration, afraid of being dragged into another Asian land war after the exhaustion of World War II, practiced what internal memos called strategic ignorance. The real surprise wasn't the invasion. It was America's deliberate choice to look away until it was too late. And by the time Washington acknowledged what was happening, Seoul was already burning. June 26 to 28, 1950. When North Korean forces captured Seoul, they didn't just occupy a city, they activated a carefully constructed shadow government that had been hiding in plain sight for years. North Korean forces entered government buildings carrying pre-prepared execution lists, names, addresses, and family details of nearly 30,000 South Koreans identified as class enemies. These lists weren't compiled through intelligence gathering. They were provided by a vast network of communist sympathizers who had been embedded in Seoul society for years. Within 72 hours, nearly every police precinct in Seoul had been emptied. Civil servants disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night. Professors vanished from university campuses. This wasn't random violence. It was the systematic elimination of South Korea's administrative infrastructure. Some of Seoul's most recognizable buildings today, including parts of Seoul National University and the former Seodamun prison, were used as temporary detention and execution sites. Over 4,000 people were executed in the basement of what is now a luxury department store. There are no memorials, no plaques, only the ghosts of those who died for being on the wrong list. The most chilling aspect wasn't the killing, it was the cooperation. Neighbors identified neighbors. Students reported teachers. The invasion didn't just exploit military weakness. It weaponized the political divisions that had been festering since 1945. As Seoul burned and bodies filled mass graves, an arrogant American general was already planning a counterattack that would escalate this police action into something far more catastrophic. September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur wasn't just a military commander. He was a man consumed by his own mythology, and he saw Korea as the stage for his greatest triumph. Operation Chromite, the Incheon landing, is celebrated as a stroke of military genius. What's never mentioned is that MacArthur deliberately misled Washington about the casualty projections. His own staff estimated 50% losses in the amphibious assault. MacArthur reported 10% to Truman. The landing succeeded against overwhelming odds. But MacArthur's true ambitions went far beyond pushing North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. Declassified personal papers reveal MacArthur had commissioned a secret provisional government plan for a unified Korea, one that would bypass both Syngman Rhee and the South Korean Constitution. His vision wasn't just to win the war, it was to remake the entire Korean peninsula in his image, just as he had done in occupied Japan. MacArthur's hubris didn't just cloud his judgment. It blinded him to the warnings coming from an unexpected direction. North of the Yalu River, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were quietly mobilizing for what would become one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. They came at night through mountain passes considered impassable. 300,000 Chinese volunteers descended upon vastly outnumbered American forces who had been assured China would never enter the war. China's intervention wasn't just a military operation. It was human wave warfare taken to apocalyptic extremes. Many Chinese soldiers carried no weapons, instructed to pick up rifles from their fallen comrades. Some units were sent forward with only 5 rounds of ammunition per soldier. What American forces didn't understand was that many Chinese soldiers were actually civilians forcibly conscripted from regions experiencing severe famine. For some, joining the army meant receiving their first full meal in months. Temperatures during the winter campaign plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. More Chinese soldiers died from hypothermia than from bullets. Some American units found Chinese corpses frozen in position, still clutching their weapons. Medical officers reported amputating limbs that shattered like glass. The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir wasn't just a military withdrawal. It was a desperate struggle for survival through a landscape transformed into a frozen hell. Soldiers on both sides begged to be shot rather than freeze to death. But the true horror of the Korean War wasn't found on the battlefield. It lurked in villages and towns where civilians became targets in a merciless ideological cleansing that both sides have spent decades trying to conceal. 1950 to 1953. By the time the guns fell silent, more than 2 million Korean civilians had perished, twice the number of military casualties. This wasn't collateral damage, it was systematic. The atrocities both sides deny. In Sinchon County, North Korea maintains a museum claiming 35,000 civilians were massacred by American and South Korean forces. Western historians dismissed it as propaganda for decades, until Soviet archival documents emerged confirming mass killings, though not on the scale North Korea claims. The uncomfortable truth lies buried in both nations' archives. South Korean right-wing militias, operating with tacit American approval, executed tens of thousands of suspected communist sympathizers, often with little more evidence than a neighbor's accusation. Declassified U.S. military reports document American aircraft strafing columns of Korean refugees mistaken for enemy troops. Internal Army communications reveal commanders refused to investigate reports of South Korean executions, fearing it would undermine the alliance. At No Gun Rai, American soldiers fired on hundreds of civilians sheltering under a railroad bridge for 3 days. The survivors' testimony was actively suppressed for almost 50 years. Their compensation when the truth finally emerged? $4,000 per death. When an armistice finally halted the fighting in 1953, nothing was resolved. No peace treaty was signed. No accountability was established. No reconciliation began. Just a ceasefire that has stretched for over 70 years, leaving Korea permanently divided by the very foreign powers that claim to be fighting for its freedom. The Korean War never truly ended. It just transformed from bombs to boycotts, from bullets to propaganda. And the Korean people, North and South, remain hostages to a conflict they never chose, separated by a scar that runs not just along the 38th parallel, but through the heart of a once unified nation. What they call the Forgotten War wasn't forgotten by accident. It was deliberately buried, because remembering its truths would force us to confront questions about who really started it, who really suffered, and whether anyone truly won. The year is 1950. The Korean War has reached its pivotal moment. U.S. bombers ordered to flatten Pyongyang aimed to do far more than just take out military targets. They aimed to break the spirit of a people. The target, not just buildings, but the ideological core of a nation still reeling from the wounds of Japan's brutal occupation. Pyongyang, gone in a week. But what if I told you it wasn't just the firebombs that destroyed the city, but the mind behind the madness that turned its ashes into a weapon? It wasn't just war, it was psychological warfare. On the people, on the soul of a nation, and on a future yet to be written. While most historical accounts focus on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Pyongyang's destruction was the largest bombing campaign of the Korean War, and it was deliberately designed to erase North Korea's identity. The Soviets knew it was coming and didn't stop it. Neither did China. Why? They needed Kim Il-sung's regime to survive, but they also needed it broken, like clay, to be reshaped into a tool of ideological war. But what if I told you Pyongyang was already a lost city before it was bombed, and the real battle was over who controlled its ashes? Pyongyang's ashes didn't just become a symbol of destruction, they became the cornerstone of a nation's paranoia, a nation built on fear, betrayal, and retribution. Kim Il-sung didn't just use the bombing for propaganda. He used it to build the framework for a permanent war. North Korea wasn't just born out of war, it was recreated by it. Kim Il-sung needed to make every citizen believe the world was actively conspiring to annihilate them. Kim Il-sung, in the months after the firebombing, enacted one of the most brutal purges of his own officers. Those who disagreed with his vision were swept away in the aftermath. The victory over the U.S. was never militarily won. It was won psychologically. This sense of betrayal turned the leader into a militant deity and his people into puppets of trauma. But the real horror wasn't just the bombing. The true terror was still to come. The ashes of Pyongyang birthed something far darker than a dictator. They birthed a phantom enemy that never stopped haunting North Korea's people. The war didn't end in 1953. The real battle began when the first bomb fell. The citizens of Pyongyang and beyond were made to carry an invisible weight, one that would eventually become their eternal justification for war. Kim Il-sung wasn't just fighting external forces. He was fighting his own people. The North Korean state became a fortress, sealed by a constant narrative of siege. With the ashes of Pyongyang in mind, Kim built a narrative where there was no choice but to fight, and no trust in the outside world. The people of North Korea weren't just made to fear the U.S. They were made to fear each other. Kim Il-sung created a surveillance state, one that encouraged neighbors to betray neighbors, a social model designed to break all human connection and trust, replacing it with total loyalty to the state. But it wasn't just the regime that enforced the siege. The people, children, parents, soldiers, were complicit in the horror. They lived in a world where the past became the future, and no one was safe from the rage. To this day, Pyongyang stands as the last monument of a city that no longer exists. Its survival wasn't just about rebuilding, it was about creating a new religion of war, one that lives on in every corner of North Korea. The bombing of Pyongyang didn't just shape the North Korean mindset, it created a religion. Kim Il-sung's personal cult wasn't simply the result of dictatorship, it was the culmination of trauma, of turning the ashes of Pyongyang into a sacred text. The bombing ensured that no other leader could ever replace him. It turned his vision of vengeance into the national identity. Pyongyang today is both a ghost town and a propaganda stage. The vast, empty spaces were deliberately left to make the city appear larger than it is. Kim Il-sung ensured that no one could ever see Pyongyang's true size, because it was never about the city, it was about the myth. What happens when a city dies and is reborn as a myth? North Korea's history, its very existence, is rooted in this question. And it might just be the answer to why the world continues to look at Pyongyang and see nothing but fire and smoke. 1953 armistice, but no peace. In 1953, the guns fell silent, but the war never ended. The armistice signed between North and South Korea wasn't peace. It created a permanent psychological battlefield that has haunted millions for generations. 1953 marked the year when the world believed it witnessed peace for the Korean peninsula. But the armistice was merely a temporary ceasefire, not an end to the war. The Korean conflict didn't conclude, it simply transformed. The DMZ, that fateful line dividing North and South, did more than separate territory. It imprisoned millions in an ongoing struggle against the very possibility of peace. This wasn't just conventional warfare. It was psychological combat that divided not only borders, but minds. When the 38th parallel split Korea, it tore families apart, created orphans, and taught people to fear their own bloodline. The armistice's greatest danger wasn't in stopping the fighting, it was in establishing the foundation for generations of division. What most don't realize is that no peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, the Korean War continues to this day. The armistice was a compromise to prevent total destruction, but the divide it created wasn't just physical, it was permanent. Behind diplomatic doors, both Soviet and American powers acknowledged that true peace on the peninsula would remain impossible as long as the Cold War continued. Korea's fate was sacrificed on the altar of global strategic interests. But what if this division wasn't accidental? What if leaders on both sides intended not just to separate the land, but to permanently fracture the collective consciousness of a people? The division cut deeper than politics. It severed personal connections. Northern families who had been landowners, educators, artists, and intellectuals found themselves branded as enemies of the state, their Southern connections systematically erased. Meanwhile, Southern families with Northern roots lived with a perpetual ache of separation. For them, the war's conclusion wasn't just about division, it was betrayal. Kim Il-sung's ascension to power was built on ensuring that no North Korean would live without war's shadow looming overhead. Trauma became his currency of control. He transformed separation into a daily ritual, ensuring his people remained chained to their suffering and thus to his authority. The Kim regime didn't merely keep families apart for practical reasons. It weaponized the fear of Southern invasion to maintain absolute control. The separation of families was deliberate, constructing a wall of fear that served the regime. Kim Il-sung didn't fear South Korea's military might as much as he feared a unified Korean people. If families reunited, his grip on power would weaken. Every separated family became an instrument of his control. But the more disturbing reality, Kim Il-sung didn't simply prevent families from reuniting. He created an entire generation that had no concept of what family truly meant. Trauma evolved into North Korea's most potent weapon, deployed not on battlefields but within citizens' hearts and minds. From the moment the DMZ was established, North Korean propaganda transformed war memories into a mythical quest for vengeance. Divided families weren't merely victims, they were chosen warriors destined to fight for the fatherland. While South Koreans moved forward with their lives out of necessity, North Koreans under Kim Il-sung's regime were trapped in an endless cycle of pain, forced to relive their trauma daily. Each loss became symbolic, an image permanently etched into the collective psyche. This wasn't about remembering history, it was about controlling the future. Kim Il-sung's fixation on perpetual conflict wasn't simply political strategy, It was deeply personal. Having experienced loss himself, he ensured no one would forget. His greatest fear wasn't external enemies, but the internal threat of reconciliation. Peace would undermine his authority. North Koreans lived in fear not primarily of external enemies, but of forgetting. To forget the war meant forgetting loyalty to Kim Il-sung, and disobedience invited ruthless consequences from a regime built on surveillance, fear, and comprehensive psychological manipulation. What if this relentless propaganda campaign was just the beginning? What if Korea's true tragedy wasn't merely its division, but the systematic destruction of human connection itself? The fighting stopped, but the war continued in other forms. As decades passed, the border remained frozen in time, while the human cost rippled across generations. Kim Il-sung achieved more than North Korea's isolation. He succeeded in disconnecting his people from their fundamental humanity. South Koreans rebuilt and moved forward. In the North, however, children learned from birth that the world stood against them. The bitterness of history wasn't just inheritance, it became essential for survival. The regime raised generations not to progress, but to remember, to nurture their pain, because within that suffering, they found their assigned purpose. The ultimate tragedy of the Korean armistice extends beyond casualties. It's the loss of possibility, a unified Korea. North and South had the potential to reunite under shared heritage and vision, but the politics of division destroyed that chance. Perhaps the greatest casualty of this unfinished war was not the Korean people themselves, but the very concept of Korean identity. The making of a god. In 1958, a 10-year-old boy in Pyongyang came home from school to find his father missing. The next day, his textbooks were replaced. The following week, the father's name was no longer listed on the war memorial he had helped build. By the end of the month, even the boy's memory of him began to feel dangerous. This wasn't merely a purge, it was psychological extinction, a campaign not just to eliminate enemies, but to erase their very existence from reality itself. 1953 to 1956. Stalin lies dead. Mao turns inward. And in the shadows of war-ravaged Korea, Kim Il-sung studies, not Marx or Lenin, but Orwell. Foreign communists, the very architects who helped install him, begin to vanish, not with public spectacle, but with surgical precision. They disappear from photographs, from official histories, from street signs. Even their children receive new truths in school, lying awake at night, terrified their own thoughts might be overheard. In 1956, Choi Chang-ik, a pro-Chinese official, was removed from power. His alleged crime? Cosmopolitan thinking. But recently uncovered evidence suggests his downfall originated from private dinner conversations, recorded by an informant embedded within his family. The betrayer? His own brother-in-law promised advancement within the party hierarchy. Kim's true genius wasn't in violence. It was in cultivating obedient paranoia. He transformed everyone into suspects of everyone else. Under such conditions, no one would risk believing in anything but him. But it wasn't enough to eliminate the body. Kim wanted to own the soul, and for that, he needed a new gospel. Yusha enters the national consciousness. What few understand is that Yusha wasn't spontaneously conceived. It was methodically constructed through years of clandestine revisions, ghost-written by party historians under constant surveillance. It masterfully fused four elements. 1. Confucian obedience to a paternal authority. 2. Stalinist historical determinism. 3. Shinto-inspired ancestor worship. 4th. Anti-colonial nationalism rooted in collective trauma. Behind the philosophy lay something even more radical. Yusha functioned as a weaponized reality filter. Between 1959 and 1961, state printing offices recalled over 300,000 books. Among them, Kim Il-sung's early speeches that lack Yusha references. These speeches were systematically rewritten. State archivists received orders to incinerate inconsistent editions. Some paid with their lives for merely possessing original versions. Children solved mathematics problems using Yush principles. Housewives incorporated its teachings into recipes. It permeated daily existence, inescapable, unchallengeable, and impossible to disprove. But belief alone can falter. What Kim required next was permanent silence, sealed borders, buried truths, and the power to erase not just individuals, but entire bloodlines. By the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung activated his final mechanism: total isolation. Foreign broadcasts systematically jammed cross-border correspondence, criminalized citizens returning from abroad, subjected to re-education, interrogation, or disappeared into secret camps. Families with connections to Japan, China, or South Korea quietly relocated to surveillance zones. In 1963, approximately 2,000 students returning from Eastern Bloc universities were quarantined in labor communes. Their transgression, speaking fluent Russian or Polish, many had returned believing they would help rebuild their homeland. Most were never seen again. Isolation was presented as protection. In reality, it was indoctrination without escape. A child born in Pyongyang would live an entire life, working, loving, and dying, without ever seeing a globe, hearing a foreign name, or even comprehending what their own nation looked like from above. North Korea didn't seal itself off fearing invasion. It closed its doors because its carefully constructed fiction could not survive exposure to outside air. And yet, as Kim Il-sung stood unopposed, crowned as God, prophet, and patriarch, he made one quiet, irreversible mistake. He gave his son a front row seat, and the boy was watching. Wasn't Juk just another form of communism? Number It was crafted to mimic ideology while functioning as psychological religion. Yush was never about economics. It was about loyalty, obedience, and spiritual dependency. Why didn't the Soviets or Chinese intervene during the purges? They attempted, half-heartedly, but Kim transformed their rivalry into leverage, playing them against each other while publicly undermining both. He constructed a Korea that no longer needed its creators. Was isolation merely a survival strategy? Number It was a deliberate control mechanism, eliminating comparative truth so no alternative reality could challenge Kim's version. There are no lies in Pyongyang, only truths too dangerous to say. Children wake up and bow to a man they've never seen. Workers chant his name before eating. Brides place flowers before his statue before kissing the groom. In North Korea, the cult isn't decoration, it's oxygen. You breathe it in, or you suffocate. Kim Il-sung didn't just kill his rivals. He deleted them. Hundreds of Soviet-trained Koreans vanished in loyalty purges. Chinese-aligned officials disappeared overnight. But this wasn't paranoia. It was ritual sacrifice, a national cleansing. What replaced them wasn't just a new elite, it was a new reality. In 1969, Kim personally ordered the redesign of school textbooks to remove any mention of the Korean language's Chinese linguistic roots. He called it cultural treason. Why? Because history had to start with him. Before him was darkness. After him was light. But even gods need a birthplace, and Kim was about to invent one. In the 1970s, propaganda departments rewrote Kim's biography. He wasn't born in a peasant village near Pyongyang. No, he was born on sacred Mount Paektu, under a double rainbow, as birds sang and snowflakes danced. They built a replica log cabin on Pektu with the sign Birthplace of the Great Leader, complete with animatronic birds. School children were bused there for mandatory pilgrimages. The regime claimed he descended from heavenly bloodlines, a divine lineage backed by Korean mythology. Because by rewriting his birth, Kim didn't just claim power, he hijacked origin. He inserted himself into cosmology. But myth needs more than belief. It needs spectacle. So Kim turned the country into a theater. Entire cities were reconstructed as shrines. 1. The 22-meter bronze statue of Kim had to be bathed in rose-pink light at all times. 2. Buildings couldn't be taller than his effigies. 3rd, school teachers were given quotas, how many times per day they must mention his name. In some villages, failure to bow to a Kim statue during a power outage resulted in re-education camp sentences. Even darkness wasn't an excuse. The state mandated emotion inspections. Workers were required to cry during national holidays or be reported for insufficient mourning. Not just totalitarian, not just surreal, liturgical. And then he died. But the calendar didn't stop, because death meant nothing to a god. Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack on July 8, 1994, but the state refused to accept it. 1. His body was embalmed, sealed in a glass tomb. 2. He was declared eternal president. 3. A new calendar began, Yusha Year 1. Kim has transcended death. He is still watching. He is still with us. As of today, North Korean calendars do not acknowledge any year before Kim's birth. It is literally year 113 in North Korean time. But a cult that swallows time cannot stop hunger. And when the famine came, faith itself began to rot. Before it starved, North Korea dreamed of building skyscrapers on the moon. In the early 1960s, when Seoul's streets were still dust and desperation, Pyongyang gleamed. Wide boulevards, Soviet-style housing blocks, a literacy rate higher than the American South. The South had U.S. troops, but the North had steel, concrete, and pride. North Korea's GDP per capita exceeded South Korea's well into the 1970s. The dream wasn't just prosperity, it was vengeance masked as triumph. Kim Il-sung's regime told its people, "We are not only surviving the imperialists, we are beating them." Factories were built underground to withstand airstrikes. Entire hills were hollowed out to create invisible military cities. By 1974, Pyongyang was producing more electricity per capita than Seoul. But no one knew the price was being written in invisible ink. And when the ink dried, it spelled famine. By the late 70s, the regime had borrowed billions from France, Sweden, even Japan, not for food, not for medicine, but for Italian marble, German printing presses, and uranium refinement. Pyongyang's subway system, decorated with chandeliers. Meanwhile, hospitals in rural North Korea had no antibiotics, only porcelain statues of the dear leader. Then in 1984, a little-known event detonated the illusion. Kim Jong-il quietly defaulted on $4.5 billion in foreign debt, the largest sovereign default at the time. Western banks blacklisted the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Trade collapsed, and no one. Imagine believing your country leads the world, then your lights start going out at night. Bread disappears from shelves. Your neighbor vanishes after joking about it. But you don't speak up, because by then, the dream had hardened into a prison. By 1991, the trains stopped running. By 1993, the ration cards were blank. But the loudspeakers still worked, broadcasting Kim Jong-il's voice. They said, "Sacrifice is victory." But soon people would begin to eat bark, and then each other. The Great Famine, 1994 to 1998. In North Korea's darkest years, the only thing growing faster than graves was the regime's military budget. Everyone says the famine happened, that it was an accident, a perfect storm, floods, sanctions, and collapse. What they don't say? It was exploited, weaponized, engineered to some degree. In 1995, as mass starvation spread, Kim Jong-il personally authorized the construction of underground facilities not for food storage, but for nuclear program shielding. This is confirmed in 1999 testimony from defector Hwang Jong-yup, the highest-ranking escapee ever. He diverted diesel and concrete to bomb shelters while children ate tree bark. Internal North Korean documents smuggled through China in 2001 describe something never mentioned in Western press: red line protocols, a classified triage system used to deliberately abandon areas considered ideologically unreliable. If your district was Class 3 on the red line scale, you no longer received 1. Rations, 2. Fuel, 3. Medical aid. One such city was Musan, near the Chinese border. There, an estimated 36,000 people died in one winter alone, but were never reported. U.S. satellite intelligence, declassified 2017, shows 1. Human migration trails in snow. 2. Unburied mass graves. 3. Empty schools converted into morgues. And yet, no international intervention came. Why? Because the Clinton administration was in secret talks with Pyongyang about halting its nuclear program. Starvation was overlooked to prevent a bomb. Contrary to myth, Kim Jong-il didn't inherit power in 1994. He took it slowly in phases. Here's what's often missed. 1. He let his own father die alone, refusing to appear publicly for months. 2. He replaced 11 out of 14 top military officials by 1996, blaming them for famine mismanagement. 3. In 1997, he restructured the Workers' Party charter to declare himself not leader, but brain of the revolution, not a head of state, a disembodied intelligence. He didn't just rise to power, he rewired the entire concept of power in North Korea. Defectors report Chinese border guards in 1996 being paid bonuses for pushing starving Koreans back into rivers. But even darker, in 1997, Chinese authorities executed 3 North Korean orphans for smuggling state secrets. What secrets? One child had written in a hidden diary, "Why does our dear leader have food when we don't?" That diary was intercepted, photographed, and logged by a human rights NGO. It disappeared in 1998. Kim Jong-il would survive this Holocaust, not as a savior, but as a phantom, rarely seen, never questioned. The next time the West saw his name in headlines, it would be paired with a nuclear test. When Kim Jong-il ascended to the throne, he inherited more than just his father's title. He inherited the blood-soaked, starved remains of a country, and he didn't just rule, it was his will that forced every North Korean to live in a world built entirely on lies. In 1994, the death of Kim Il-sung wasn't just a succession crisis, it was an existential terror. Kim Jong-il was already feared, not just for his tyrannical potential, but because no one knew what kind of monster would rise from the ashes of his father's legend. For the people of North Korea, it wasn't a peaceful transition, it was the beginning of a silent war waged on their very existence. Kim Jong-il didn't simply inherit power, he absorbed it, using manipulation, paranoia, and mind games to rule a country on the brink of collapse. His first move? Eliminate every challenger. Even his own uncle was purged under a cloud of suspicion and fear. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. The so-called dear leader didn't want the world to see him as a mere dictator. He wanted to be God. His appearance, his lifestyle, and his public persona were all part of the same spectacle. He spent millions on films where he was the hero, building monuments to a self-created myth that was more powerful than reality itself. By the late 90s, North Korea's reality had fractured. The military-industrial complex dominated everything, and resources that should have gone to feeding people were spent on missiles, bunkers, and his personal image. While starving citizens eked by on meager rations, Kim Jong-il spent billions on a nuclear program, siphoning aid from the already weakened economy. North Korea was bracing for an apocalypse, but they were prepared for something no one in the West had yet fully grasped. Kim Jong-il was playing for keeps. But here's the shocking part. The famine that ravaged the country, Kim Jong-il allowed it to happen. Not because he couldn't have stopped it, but because he saw it as a tool to eliminate perceived traitors and to solidify his grip. Whole villages vanished, not just from starvation, but from fear. The famine was a natural disaster, but the cruelty was man-made. While the world tried to reach out, sending aid and offering peace talks, Kim Jong-il saw it all as weakness. His goal was clear: to turn the world into a witness to his godlike power. Every failure on the international stage was just another opportunity for him to play the puppet master. And as the sun set on the 20th century, he began his final move. A nuclear program that would isolate him from the world, but bind him to something darker. A future where North Korea would never bow. What if the world's most dangerous nuclear crisis wasn't caused by missiles or bombs, but by a single man who knew exactly when to strike and when to retreat in a game of global chess that would alter history forever? In the early 2000s, North Korea was teetering on the edge of desperation. With a population still devastated from the Great Famine, a government as reclusive as it was unpredictable, and an economy on the brink of collapse, the world assumed one thing: North Korea would implode. The United States, Japan, South Korea, and China, each with their own conflicting interests, were eager for diplomacy, hopeful for any sign of peace. But unbeknownst to the world, Kim Jong-il was already playing a game of manipulation that would redefine his country's survival. The six-party talks had started under the assumption that dialogue and economic incentives could bring North Korea back from the brink. But what the world didn't understand was that Kim Jong-il saw diplomacy not as a pathway to peace, but as a luxury he could afford to toy with. Every concession made was a small piece of a larger strategy to keep the world guessing, to feed off their hope. 2003, the six-party talks begin. To the world, it's a hope for peace. To Kim Jong-il, it's a smokescreen. Behind the veneer of diplomacy, Kim's true intentions are playing out in private. He doesn't want peace. He wants leverage, and he wants time. The nuclear program was never a weapon to be used. It was a currency, an asset to be traded for survival. But here's what's rarely told. Every promise made during these talks was carefully calibrated to keep the U.S. and other powers hooked. Each time the world pushed North Korea to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure, Kim Jong-il would promise, and each time he would deliberately fail. He wasn't blind to the consequences. He knew the world's leaders would tire, would eventually break, would compromise, and that's when he would strike. 2006, a devastating breakthrough. North Korea conducts its first underground nuclear test. But it wasn't just the explosion that sent shockwaves through the global community. It was the realization that Kim Jong-il had perfected a form of blackmail that no one was prepared for. His nuclear ambitions were not just about creating weapons, They were his ticket to survival in an international system that viewed him as a madman. What Kim Jong-il had already figured out was this: when the world is forced to look away from you in fear, they can't ignore you. His nuclear tests weren't just provocations, they were masterful psychological maneuvers. He forced the world to focus its attention on the one thing that could never be ignored. The result? Every test, every threat, made Kim stronger, not weaker. He knew exactly how far he could push, and he knew the US and China would always respond with a combination of sanctions and negotiation. But the truth? Sanctions only worked in theory. In reality, they did nothing to slow Kim's nuclear program, and in fact, they served to reinforce his legitimacy back home. Sanctions kept the regime's control intact and allowed him to rally the nation against foreign adversaries. To Kim Jong-il, every failed promise was just another building block in a strategy that was far more dangerous than anyone realized. Kim Jong-il wasn't just playing with nuclear weapons. He was playing with lives, his people's lives. The cyclical nature of the six-party talks wasn't just a diplomatic back and forth. It was a manipulation of the world's most powerful players. And in the background, North Korea's internal situation continued to worsen. While the world worried about the possibility of a nuclear North Korea, Kim Jong-il was using that fear as his primary tool for survival. The more unstable his country became, the more desperate the world grew, and the more he could leverage it for his own benefit. And then came the tipping point. With every test, every round of failed diplomacy, the world continued to beg Kim Jong-il to halt his nuclear ambitions, but he only escalated. By the time 2011 arrived, the regime was stronger than ever. But would Kim Jong-il's manipulation last forever? Or would his son, Kim Jong-un, take over and push the game to even more terrifying extremes? What would the next move be, and how would the world react to a leader even more unpredictable than Kim Jong-il? Would the world be ready for what came next? The final answer came just as the curtain fell on Kim Jong-il's rule, and the stakes were raised higher than ever before. The state doesn't just control your body in North Korea. It owns your soul. And if you betray them, the price isn't just your life. It's your entire family wiped off the map for eternity. It's the late 1990s. Kim Jong-il has tightened his grip over North Korea. But what happens when a nation turns the act of survival into the ultimate betrayal? Every step you take, every breath you take, is scrutinized. And behind the curtain of state-sponsored propaganda, a darker truth lurks. While the outside world sees a reclusive, unpredictable dictatorship, what's hidden inside is a complex web of loyalty, betrayal, and survival at any cost. North Korea isn't just a regime. It's a society where fear is the currency and punishment is a family affair. In the shadows of the streets, behind every conversation, and within every home, a single question hangs over North Korean citizens. Can you survive without betraying those you love? For most, the answer is no. The 3 generations of punishment policy is not just a tool of control. It's a psychological weapon. If one family member is arrested for a crime, the entire family, parents, children, even grandparents, will be punished. This is not a theory. It is a practice, and the cost is measured in lives destroyed. This chilling reality plays out behind closed doors, where families are torn apart. But here's the unsettling twist. Many North Koreans live with the knowledge that any one of them could be next. The regime doesn't care about the facts. It only cares about loyalty, and that loyalty is demanded to the point of self-destruction. Every society has a dark underbelly, but in North Korea, this underbelly thrives out of sheer necessity. The black market, a world unseen by the state, is the lifeblood of survival. A loaf of bread might cost half your life savings, But illegal trade becomes the only option when the state fails to provide. But here's the shocker. The regime knows it's happening. The government turns a blind eye to these illegal dealings because without them, the economy would crumble. But in this twisted system, the black market isn't just an act of rebellion, it's an act of survival. And somehow, in this world of defiance, a strange form of autonomy emerges. People gain small, fleeting moments of freedom by breaking the law. But here's the catch. No one is safe, not even the black marketeers. The regime actively tracks down these underground markets, but it's a game of cat and mouse. Just as the state tightens its grip, people push back harder. But is this underground economy a path to greater freedom? Or is it a ticking time bomb waiting to explode? In North Korea, the regime doesn't just enforce laws, it enforces beliefs. Kim Jong-il's regime didn't just want the people's obedience, it wanted their hearts and minds. And that's where the regime's propaganda machine goes to work. The public isn't just bombarded with images of Kim Jong-il. They're fed myths, the belief that the leader is a living god. The state builds monuments to him, constructs operas glorifying his rise, and even traces his ancestry to the sacred Mount Paektu, linking him to the divine origins of Korea itself. It's a brilliant move, turning a dictator into a deity. But here's the kicker. These revolutionary operas aren't just performances. They are indoctrination tools used to rewrite the very history of the country. In this twisted narrative, Kim Jong-il is not just the leader, he is the savior of North Korea. But it goes further than mere propaganda. Did you know that in the early 2000s, the regime started building an entire fake city, a stage set to impress foreign diplomats and journalists? This city was a model of prosperity and order, built specifically to deceive the world. Meanwhile, in the real North Korea, people starved and lived in fear. The regime's obsession with appearances runs so deep that they're willing to sacrifice the truth itself. The eternal flame. What would it take for a man raised in the West, surrounded by luxury and comfort, to slaughter his family for power? The truth is chilling, and it's not what you think. It's 2011. The dear leader, Kim Jong-il, has passed away, and the world holds its breath. Everyone expected chaos. But what they didn't expect was Kim Jong-un, the son who spent most of his life in the luxuries of Switzerland, to suddenly rise to power. What was he thinking? Could a man educated in the West, a man who knew comfort and freedom, ever rule with the same iron fist his father and grandfather wielded? Kim Jong-un's rise to power wasn't about raw ambition. It was about survival. Beneath the facade of the young, relatable leader lay a mind that was terrifyingly cold. Within months of taking power, Kim Jong-un ordered the execution of his uncle, Jang Song-taek, the very man who had helped elevate his position. No one was safe. Kim didn't just want the throne. He wanted to eliminate any rival to his rule, even if it meant sacrificing his own blood. While the West watched, wondering if Kim could truly consolidate power, the real story was happening behind closed doors. Kim Jong-un wasn't just brutal, he was calculated. His time in Europe didn't soften him, it hardened him. He'd learned the importance of image in Western media, the very thing that helped European leaders stay in power. And he used that knowledge to reshape his image, carefully curating the public narrative. But what made his story truly terrifying was that he was playing both sides. 1. On the world stage, he was portrayed as a modern, nuclear-powered leader. 2. Domestically, he maintained the myth of the Kims as godlike figures who commanded complete loyalty. The truth behind these moves was far darker than the world realized. Kim Jong-un didn't just want to rule, He wanted to control how history would remember him. But while the world was entranced by Kim's modern image, he was orchestrating a subversive scheme, one that would forever alter how the Kim dynasty operated. Why is he so desperate to erase his family's history? The executions of his uncle and half-brother weren't just about eliminating competition. They were about sending a clear message to the world. Only Kim Jong-un matters. But there's a deeper, darker motivation. These executions are the physical embodiment of the Kim family's eternal legacy. Loyalty comes at any cost. Kim Jong-un, like his predecessors, wants not just power, but total allegiance, even if it means murdering those closest to him. Kim Jong-un's rise to power wasn't all about force and violence. He used Western-style diplomacy and even pop culture to bolster his image. In 2013, North Korea held its first-ever K-pop concert. To some, this might seem like an attempt to modernize. To others, it was a carefully orchestrated manipulation of the media designed to soften Kim's image and gain favor with both the domestic population and international leaders. But here's the catch. These modern moves were all calculated, even while the regime tightened its grip at home. K-pop concerts? They were about control, not just appeasing the people. Because Kim Jong-un knows something most people don't. You can control a nation by controlling how it sees itself. What the world doesn't know is that Kim Jong-un has a terrifying obsession with one thing above all: the legacy of the Kim family. He's willing to manipulate global media, murder his relatives, and force his people into total submission to make sure no one ever forgets who's in charge. But what's really behind this obsession? In 2018, as the world held its breath, the US and North Korea signed a piece of paper that promised peace, yet not a single thing changed. But the real question is this: who was the real winner of this historic summit? 2018 to 2020, a time of both hope and deep cynicism. A world grappling with unprecedented diplomacy between two of the most unpredictable figures on the planet: Kim Jong-un, the nuclear tyrant, and Donald Trump, the reality TV showman turned president. Kim Jong-un, educated in Switzerland, ruthless in his quest for power, and the mastermind behind a regime that had survived decades of global isolation. A young dictator who knew that the nuclear card was the only way to gain respect and leverage. Donald Trump, the outsider president, a master of media manipulation, who came to the negotiating table with bravado but little strategy. His motivations? A legacy defined by peace, a personal triumph over North Korea, but no real blueprint for what success would look like. In 2018, Kim Jong-un's regime was on the brink of economic collapse. The sanctions were biting, the people were growing restless, and his nuclear ambitions were starting to generate more international scrutiny than ever. Yet at the very moment the world thought he was isolated, Kim had already begun a quiet transformation of his strategy. The summits were his way out, but they were not about denuclearization. They were about survival. The media painted it as a historic breakthrough. Trump, flanked by advisors, sat across from Kim with a smile. In front of the world, they signed a vague declaration that promised to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. But no one truly understood what was unfolding behind the scenes. Kim had already secured a victory. He had taken his seat at the global table. He wasn't being recognized as a pariah anymore. He was treated like a leader. But what did Trump really gain? On paper, nothing. No concessions, no timelines, no verifiable actions. It was all theater. For Kim, it was the ultimate chess move. He won recognition without having to give anything up. But what Trump missed was that Kim Jong-un was playing a longer game, a game of manipulating perceptions, not just negotiating deals. The second summit, Hanoi 2019, was a total collapse. Trump's negotiators were baffled by Kim's sudden walkout. But Kim had one simple goal: to test the West. He knew that by walking away, he would create a new reality. He would force the U.S. to return to the table. And Trump? He was caught in his own trap. He needed a deal for political gain, but he had no leverage. The summit's failure wasn't just because of stubbornness. It was strategic on both sides. These summits weren't about making deals. They were about posturing, perception, and the narrative. Kim Jong-un knew that the global community was hungry for success stories after decades of failure, and by engaging in dialogue, he gave the world what it wanted: hope. But in reality, he was buying time, securing his status, and protecting his regime, all while secretly bolstering his nuclear program. In return, Trump was trying to secure a victory without understanding that diplomacy with a tyrant who controls every aspect of his nation isn't about making deals. It's about making moves. What the world didn't know is that during the Trump-Kim summits, behind closed doors, North Korea was secretly expanding its nuclear infrastructure. Kim Jong-un used the summits to buy time, to push forward his nuclear ambitions unhindered. His regime was focused on more than just the optics. It was laying the groundwork for a future strike capability that could no longer be ignored. While Trump was caught up in the grand gesture of diplomacy, Kim played the long game, delaying, deflecting, and ultimately doubling down on his nuclear program. What Trump failed to understand was that the summits were never about denuclearization. They were about empowering Kim and giving him a platform. Kim didn't care about a deal. He cared about image, control, and survival. For Trump, the summits were supposed to be a personal triumph, a legacy-building moment for his presidency. Instead, they became an embarrassment. He handed Kim the global stage, only for Kim to walk away with nothing tangible lost and his nuclear weapons untouched. But the most shocking twist of all? In the end, Kim Jong-un had already won the summit before he even sat down. He had already ensured that his grip on power would not only survive, but thrive, all while the world watched. The real question we must ask is, what's next? In the face of sanctions, global pressure, and isolation, North Korea should have fallen. So why hasn't it? Because the regime has perfected one thing: control over the mind itself. From the ashes of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea found itself not only cut off from its traditional patrons, but now facing worldwide sanctions, economic collapse, and an increasingly hostile global community. The Kim family was isolated, but that was exactly where they thrived. Most outsiders see North Korea's stranglehold on its population as a result of pure fear: the fear of military retaliation, of starvation, of nuclear annihilation. But that's just the surface. The true reason North Korea still exists is because the regime has weaponized the human psyche. The myth isn't about external threats. It's about making the people believe that their entire existence is defined by the Kim family. How does the regime survive? It doesn't survive on weapons alone. It survives because every person breathes the myth in their daily life. When Kim Jong-un's regime enforces strict ideological purity, it does so with one simple tactic: it rewrites history daily. The idea that the Kim family has been chosen by a higher power to save the people from chaos is more potent than any bomb or missile. When the people believe that their very identity is tied to the myth of their ruler, they become indispensable in holding the regime up. If the myth falters, so does everything else. When Kim Jong-un inherited power in 2011, He didn't just inherit a nation in turmoil, he inherited a system of belief so ingrained in the people's consciousness that to challenge it was unthinkable. But here's the shock. Kim Jong-un had no choice but to reinforce the myth even more. Why? Because the truth was too dangerous. His nation was starving, and its infrastructure was falling apart. The myth was the only thing that kept the people's minds from drifting into desperation. This young, untested leader had one task above all: make the people believe in the Kim family's divine right to rule, no matter how much they suffered. So he did what any leader in crisis would do. He used propaganda and nuclear brinkmanship as his greatest tools. He wasn't just playing politics, he was playing with his people's minds. K-pop concerts in North Korea, Western-style movies in the heart of Pyongyang. These were not just for an entertainment. This was Kim Jong-un's twisted genius at work. He was modernizing the country while keeping its people locked in a time warp of belief and obedience. As the world watched in awe, North Korea continued to thrive by mixing the old myths with new distractions, distracting its people long enough to keep them blindly loyal. But here's where the shock comes. The Kim regime isn't just surviving. They are actively manipulating the world's perception of their power. The reality? North Korea's survival is about controlling the narrative, not just the economy or military. If the myth starts to unravel, the regime could face a mass uprising, or worse, a slow, self-inflicted collapse. Kim Jong-un is more terrified than ever that his own people might wake up to the truth. What happens when the myth begins to fade? When the younger generation, who has grown up on disinformation, begins to realize there is a different world outside. Kim Jong-un's regime knows that the cracks in the myth are widening, and it's not just a matter of keeping old secrets. If the people stop believing in the infallibility of their leaders, everything could fall apart in a matter of days. What would happen if the myth crumbles? Could the regime survive the collapse of its own narrative? The real question is, what if the people decide to rewrite the myth themselves, but this time as a story of revolution, not worship? You know who's watching the world more closely than anyone? North Korea, and they've learned that survival is easier when the world thinks you're insane. Year 2020 onward, Kim Jong-un, Chinese back-channel operatives, U.S. diplomatic ghosts, South Korean defectors turned double agents. While the world obsesses over whether Kim is irrational, Pyongyang has mastered calculated madness. They fake unpredictability because it's more terrifying than truth. And here's the truth. Kim doesn't want war. He wants permanent crisis. War would end him. Crisis ensures he never has to feed his people, just frighten them. What if the most dangerous thing about North Korea is that it no longer fears being understood? Over 70% of North Koreans living near the border with China now consume foreign media, TV dramas, K-pop, even reality shows, smuggled in on micro SD cards the size of a fingernail. But here's what's rarely discussed. The regime now embeds tracking codes in fake South Korean media files, planting spyware in USBs, then monitoring who spreads them. The punishment? Not death, entrapment. They let you live, infect others, then arrest everyone at once to send a message. What happens when entertainment becomes the regime's most effective surveillance tool? We've heard about 3 generations of punishment, but most don't know how it's engineered. Here's the classified part. Children in punishment camps are sometimes adopted into elite military orphan programs, reprogrammed into loyalist shock troops. Their identities are erased, their loyalty measured by how easily they denounce their parents. This isn't punishment, it's genetic treason, a system designed to obliterate memory itself. No graves, no photos, no names left behind. What kind of state survives by deleting the very concept of family? The regime is crumbling, but not in the way people think. There's no civil war coming, no coup. Instead, there's hollowing. Ministries are broke, generals defect, food is fake, plastic rice, sawdust bread. North Korea isn't a ticking time bomb. It's a rotting architecture, a ghost nation sustained by illusion, brutality, and the algorithmic apathy of a world that no longer pays attention. What happens when the system collapses? But the myth doesn't. If you want to understand North Korea, you have to admit it's not alien. It's everything the modern world is too ashamed to admit it tolerates. Forced loyalty? Check. Surveillance culture? Check. Hero worship? Weaponized distraction? Digital propaganda? Look around. The difference isn't in the tools. It's in how brazenly North Korea uses them. This isn't a regime frozen in time. It's a magnified version of ourselves, hyper-controlled, deeply addicted to myth, and running on a permanent crisis economy. If this story disturbed you, good. It means you're still awake. But awareness isn't enough. You are now part of the silence or the signal. Share this. Break the algorithm. Force the world to look where it's trained not to. Subscribe for the next truth they don't want you to hear, because North Korea isn't just a regime. It's a warning, and it's closer than you think.